The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio. A Pause for Thought is intended to be a thoughtful forum for thoughtful people, and you are encouraged to call in at 225-343-9927, 343-9927, and the only rules being that we be respectful and not rant. Anyhow, the topic for this evening, and Lang Baker is with me. Good evening, Lang.
Hi, Wayne.
Topic for this evening is FDA approval or accelerated approval of orphan drugs or niche drugs, so-called. And Lang and everybody, what got me thinking about this this issue was an article I read in The Economist, the October 15th edition of The Economist, and a Wall Street Journal article from September 19th, 2016. I'm sorry, no, it's a Washington Post article from that date concerning this particular drug, or concerning accelerated approval of a particular drug. It's the first treatment for a rare form of muscular dystrophy called Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I think that's how you pronounce it. Did you happen to look it up? Okay.
I didn't.
And the way both the Washington Post and The Economist describe it is it's a devastating, invariably fatal disease that affects between 9,000 and 12,000 boys in the United States. Boys with the disease grow progressively weaker, becoming reliant on a wheelchair in their teens and dying in their 20s and 30s. So the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, granted accelerated approval for this over the objections of half the people on their panel, as I understand it, and it was the director of the FDA, Jane Woodcock, who overrode the decision of the panel and went ahead and insisted that it be put out after much emotional testimony by people that suffer from this disease. And I wanted to point out real quickly, Lang, the four approaches to drug approval, and I know you have something to share on this too, for FDA approval of drugs. Fast Track, which we hear a lot about in the news, is a process designed to facilitate the development and expedite the review of drugs to treat serious conditions and fill an unmet medical need. And by the way, this is from the FDA's own website. They're giving this brief summary here, and they have detailed descriptions, further in. Then there is breakthrough therapy, a process designated to expedite the development and review of drugs which may demonstrate substantial improvement over available therapy. Then there is accelerated approval, and it says here, these regulations allow drugs for serious conditions that filled an unmet medical need to be approved based on a surrogate endpoint, and I'll get back to the surrogate endpoint in a second. Then there is priority review. A priority review designation means FDA's goal is to take action on an application within 6 months. And I couldn't find it stated anywhere, but I'm pretty sure taking action means decide yes or no to approve. But getting back to the accelerated approval, they say that it can be based on a surrogate endpoint, and the way the FDA describes a surrogate endpoint is a laboratory measurement, radiographic image, physical sign, or other measure that is thought to predict clinical benefit. But is not itself a measure of clinical benefit. Likewise, an intermediate clinical endpoint is a measure of a therapeutic effect that is considered reasonably likely to predict the clinical benefit of a drug, such as an effect on irreversible morbidity and mortality. And of course, it states that it relies entirely on scientific consensus for this surrogate endpoint and everything else. But as we know from these articles here and other cases we've seen in the media, testimony by people suffering from the problems carries a lot of weight.
Yeah, so I looked over the FDA website to try to see if I could understand what these processes are. And it's actually, it isn't like four completely separate processes that we're talking about. There were complaints about it taking years for drugs to be approved by the FDA. So back in 1992, a law was passed that created the priority review process. And under that process, there are two alternative standards that a drug submitted for approval by the FDA can receive faster consideration under the priority review, and the drug manufacturer pays a fee to the FDA for this. It's like, I guess, paying for a fast lane on the freeway or something like that, where they pay a fee to get their drug handled on an expedited manner.
It's determined by money?
Well, no, it's not determined, but that's part of how you get into that process. You have to pay the fee, but you have to meet one of two standards. Either the drug you're presenting for review will present a major advance in treatment, or it will provide treatment where no adequate treatment already exists. So if there's something out there already to treat this disease, you've got to show you a major improvement in the treatment, or there's no. And then if you meet that standard, then you can pay the fee and get a faster process, faster transition through the review process with the FDA. So that's priority review. And then 5 years later, Fast Track was created for new drugs, and it has two standards that have to be met before you can get Fast Track. And they aren't alternative. You have to meet both of these. You have to show promise in the treatment of a serious life-threatening condition. So it's not for all drugs out there. It's not like for something for backache or something like that. It has to be a life-threatening, serious life-threatening condition. And in addition, the drug that's proposed for review has to have the potential to address an unmet medical need, which means there's no drug out there, or there's a drug that doesn't work as well, that you're going to show superior performance of your drug you're presenting for review, either in the effectiveness of the drug or in avoiding serious side effects of what's already out there.
And that's for the
and that's where you get on Fast Track.
Yeah.
And then that's the review process. The priority review and Fast Track are two ways of reviewing it. But once you get into that review, you're hoping that your drug is going to get approved. And so accelerated approval is something you qualify for if you've been accepted for Fast Track. You can also then request accelerated approval of it. And what accelerated approval does, as I understand it from reading over the FDA website, is that allows you to get action by the FDA without having going through the whole clinical trial process. And that's where the surrogate marker comes in.
Right.
It's a way to get approval without doing the total review process. So once you get accelerated approval, you're still subject to follow-up clinical tests clinical trials that may result in withdrawing that approval.
Right, and they do mention that in these articles. But I guess the problem was with what they considered to be a marker or whatever. And one of the things was, I believe, they simply said that it seemed to cause improvement in the subjects that they evaluated. But the problem was, what the both articles state here is that there are estimated 9,000 to 12,000 boys in the U.S. with this particular muscular dystrophy, and yet they only took 12 for their study.
Yeah.
And they picked 12 that had a gene that occurs. I mean, I'm not sure. They say that it causes a genetic mutation, but they also go on to say here that only 13% of the total number of boys with this genetic or this problem have this gene.
Yeah, it's like a disease might be caused, if a disease is described as a certain failure of an organ, or in here it's muscles, I believe, in atrophy of the muscles, it's like that condition may have been the result of one of a variety of different causes. It doesn't mean that just because it manifests the same way that it's the manifestation of the same cause in all the people that have it. Like they said, 9,000 to 12,000 kids have this, show this kind of degeneration. Yeah, but there's only like 13% of them that they've identified that is caused by this genetic defect.
Right.
So that means that you're really talking about maybe 150 kids in the country.
And only maybe,
out of those 9 to 12,000 that would be supposedly benefit from this treatment if the treatment proves out to be effective.
Right. And as far as as I saw here anyway, the so-called surrogate endpoint that they used, the clinical marker, was simply anecdotal evidence that the kids lived longer than expected or were doing better and degenerating less slowly.
More slowly?
More slowly, yeah, thanks. Sorry, more slowly. And, of course, they also had a great deal of emotional testimony in front of the FDA.
Well, yeah, if your kid's got this disease that generally kills by the age of 20 or before the age of 20, you don't have a very long time to try to get a handle on that and get you to save your kid's life.
Well, no, I understand.
Of course, they're going to be emotional about it.
Yes, and I understand.
The question before the FDA is whether the treatment being approved is effective, and I guess it's a balancing here about how much risk somebody wants to take if they've got no alternative, and here's something that might work, and there's nothing else that will work, and you're going to die before the age of 20 if you don't do anything. You're willing to try anything. And
yeah.
so I can see that there's that argument for going ahead and approving something to say, okay, well, you can go ahead and try this. Maybe it'll work. We don't know. But you don't have any alternative.
Right, but I guess another question is, though, I mean, the patients are involved in this, of course, but somebody's got to pay for this stuff, right?
That's another controversy.
And I'd like to know if anybody listening has a point of view on that. Should the people who are emotionally involved in this drug approval process have a significant say in the approval? And who should pay for it? What should the taxpayer pay for it? In fact, so call in 343-9927, 343-9927 if you have anything to add to that point of view. In laying that was one point that the Economist article made. They say this judgment is more worrying because it does not come out of the blue. Politicians have been urging the FDA to be more responsive, blah, blah, blah. They go on to state that it creates an incentive for meaningless innovation for drug companies to tilt investment towards drugs that may not work, but which patients definitely want, and towards pursuing novelty at the expense of efficacy. Thank you. And it also, here's the point, passes more of the risk involved in drug development to consumers and taxpayers. Politicians routinely castigate pharmaceutical industry officials for charging too much for their products, and now Sarepta is the pharmaceutical company that came up with this drug. Their ad hoc testing or post hoc testing program will in effect be paid for by the American government and by insurers. So they're basically, with the regulations and these emotionally charged decisions, dumping the cost on other people if these people are going to get these drugs. And with such a study, I just have to wonder if that's a good idea, you know?
Yeah, well, some commentators have proposed that if it doesn't work, the drug company has to refund the money.
Is that a requirement, or that just
no? That's what some of the commentators have proposed. Is say,
well,
that they should take that risk. That if their drug, that's apart from the argument about what's fair compensation for the drug,
Yeah, they should invest the money up front and take the risk, is really how it should be. But they're not. They're dumping it off. I think that's also how our the research procedures go for new military hardware. A long time back, I think during the Reagan administration, they changed the rules to where the government pays for the research ahead of time or whatever, instead of the arms companies doing it instead, with their own money or their
Well,
shares.
another argument could be if the government's or the taxpayer through the government's paying for all this, then they should own the intellectual rights to it and gather all, the patent earnings off of it.
Yeah, good point.
And if the government owns it, then they ought to be able to license it to other producers so that you got competition in the production.
Yeah. And I wonder now, with approval of this, if the drug itself turns out to be harmful or whatever, or doesn't work, can people can't sue the FDA, but they can probably sue the drug company, and that's happened before.
Now, you can sue anybody. The question is whether you can
Well,
win.
that's true. Whether you can win, yeah. But yeah, speaking of costs, Sarepta, this pharmaceutical company, said the average cost of this drug, they expect it to be $300,000 per year. And the company does offer plans to offer financial assistance to help uninsured or underinsured payments pay for the drug. But they're also expecting peak sales of the drug to be $400 million in the U.S.
Well, yeah, I don't see how they come up with that number of 400 million when they say 13% out of 1,200 kids have that genetic defect. That's somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 kids in the country.
That's what I could.
And so if you say it's 300,000 per kid and 150 kids, well, it's over multiple years. How many years the kid takes it? So I guess it could add up to that over the lifetime.
Yeah, but still, the flip side of that is only 13% of the kids with this disease actually have that genetic marker,
right.
And that means 87% of them don't.
Yeah.
So how can we call that an indication that you're going to develop? I mean, they don't say anything about how they connected that.
Well, I think they said that 13% of the kids have this genetic defect, and then the marker's not the gene; it's some other chemical in the body that is associated with the disease.
But
so
they only
their treatment is only good for, if it's good at all, it's only good for the 13% that have that genetic defect.
Yes, and what do you say to the argument that if it saves one life, I mean, what would you say to a parent whose son was dying from this, and you just didn't want to see it approved?
Well,
put you on the spot there, man.
No, I'm saying that the FDA is supposed to be operating under a set of rules. And if the rule, and you say there's been pressure on them, but that doesn't mean it's written into the rules that you give, predominant weight to the desires of the people who want the treatment, or whether you are governed by the science of whether the studies have established the standard that's in the rules.
Right. And I'm kind of with you there. I think we should rely strictly on the science. I don't see why. I understand wanting to give people hope, but give them a placebo and tell them it works. I mean, I know that's terrible to say, but I said it. But I guess it just, to me, at some point you got to give up. At some point you got to say, okay, I got a bad deal, And we in America, I think, because we're so rich, we try to push these things. Go ahead.
If you want to look at cost benefit on saving lives, you can look at the statistics that come out on how many kids die because of the air pollution that we allow because we don't have controls on emissions, and how much would it cost per life saved to reduce that air pollution?
A good point. Of course, that argument doesn't tend to get a whole lot of traction anywhere, for obvious reasons. Oh, interestingly enough, though, China, the evil communist country, has implemented significant environmental controls on their coal plants and everything, precisely because of the air pollution there. But of course, there were days when you couldn't breathe outside, literally.
Well, that's happening in India right now. It's been in the news the last few days.
So anyway, I see your point there. But you looked at this Health Policy Lab study too, right? Or this article?
Yeah.
It's an article by Donald W. Light. July 6, 2015. Health Policy Lab, if anybody wants to check it out, Health Affairs blog. Let's see. Annually, prescription drugs cause over 81 million adverse reactions and result in 2.7 million hospitalizations. This epidemic of harm from medications makes our prescription drugs the fourth leading cause of death in the United States. And with that track record for, I guess, the overall approval process, with that kind of a record, it seems to me that at least in cases like this one right here with Duchenne, the treatment for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, you're making it even worse, or you're even lessening the odds of something good coming out of it. Am I making my point correctly on that, or does that make sense?
That could be your point. It seems to me like you don't know what the odds are because the science isn't there.
Well, that is true, but I mean, the likelihood of something, overall causing so many deaths, we could end up causing even more deaths now by lowering the standard, is what I'm saying. These drugs could cause even more problems. I mean, this 81 million adverse reactions and 2.7 million hospitalizations, the fourth leading cause of death in the United States, that's significant enough. And now we're going to lower the standards by allowing these emotional arguments to come in. That's the way I'm seeing it. It just, I find it baffling. You're listening to A Pause for Thought. This is Wayne Parker with Lang Baker. Feel free to call in, 343-9927, 343-9927, if you'd like to ask a question or make a point. We'd sure appreciate it. All right, Lang, you found some other things with this. I did want to mention first, another point The Economist made was the push toward drugs that were simply novelties or that had no real significant effect. And I think that point was made in the the Health Policy Lab article too.
Yeah.
See the statistic there?
Yeah, well, right. And they had a graph in that Health Policy Lab showing new drugs introduced from 2002 to 2011. And about 94% of the new drugs approved offered little or no improvement over existing drugs. And some critics have referred to this as the Me Too phenomenon, where drug companies just go to create slight variations from what's already out there just so that they can get something out on the market and have their patent on it and try to grab a share of the market, kind of like the way breakfast cereal companies have, scads of different varieties up there to fill up the shelves just to try to grab more share of the market. And here they're bogging down the FDA drug approval process by submitting all these slight variations that really don't do anything to offer some new breakthrough drug.
Yeah. Now again, these aren't drugs that necessarily got any kind of priority approval or accelerated approval process, but
right. But
overall, still the
reason they created the priority process was because it was taking so long to approve drugs through the regular process, because there's if over 90% of the drugs submitted to the pipeline for approval aren't really offering any major benefit, then it's like you've got the system clogged with a bunch of
So now you got to pay money to get moved to the head of the line, or get accelerated. I never thought about that. Good point.
And there's also a staffing issue at FDA. They've got 700 vacancies in their staff, I read in one article. And another article here shows that out of the 1,300 or so employees in the drug approval center there, that very small number of them, only 72 out of 1,300 are in charge of testing the safety or responsible for the safety side of it. So when you talk about have those statistics on all the adverse effects, part of that probably attributable to inadequate safety.
Yeah. Well, look at the great big fancy highly touted drug for diabetes, Avandia, years back.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was put on that, and it was I didn't have insurance at the time, couldn't get insurance, and I was paying over $400 a month for that. And I was seeing this really great nurse practitioner, medically seeing, and he had a very cynical view of the whole medical process, whole medical care industry in America. He said it was all pretty much a scam, but he saw that I was on Avandia, and he said, Wayne, I'm going to take you off Avandia and double your metformin. Metformin is an old drug. It has no side effects. It's been around for ages, and this is how he explained it to me. It's very inexpensive, and I've done fine since getting off the Avandia. Now, of course, the Avandia was eventually withdrawn. I think it's still there for certain treatments, but it's restricted because it increases the likelihood of developing heart disease or having heart failure.
Yeah, there are a number of drugs that have run into that problem. Probably the best known are the recalls of Vioxx, which was a painkiller that had been taken by millions of Americans but caused heart attacks and strokes. And ended up Merck they sold $2.5 billion worth of Vioxx worldwide in 2003 before it was recalled. And FDA reviewer estimated up to 139,000 people taking Vioxx suffered heart attack or stroke, and 40% of them died because of the FDA's haste in approving that drug.
Oh, so that was one that got some form of accelerated, or
I don't know whether it was accelerated or not, but it didn't get adequate safety review.
No, apparently not.
And ended up being recalled after 40% of 139,000 died. I don't know off the top of my head. I guess that's somewhere around 50,000 people died from heart attack or stroke from taking Vioxx.
Yeah, and did you say that if it had any significant effect or positive effect before they discovered these?
This article didn't say.
Okay.
It was a painkiller. So there's lots of painkillers on the market. It's not like that's the only painkiller around.
Right. Yeah, and you mentioned how they flood the market with the drugs. Something I read years ago showed that because of computer generation of models, they are able to come up with combinations of drugs like crazy to propose, and then they can advertise them on television and tell people, look, if you have this condition.
Yeah, they spend 2 to 3, according to some of these articles, 2 to 3 times as much on advertising as they do on research.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, yeah.
And they claim research is the reason they have to charge so much for their drugs.
Yes, as a matter of fact, this same health blog study states here that companies spend 2 to 3 times less on research than on marketing, to 2 to 3 times less on research than on marketing. So the marketing budgets are 2 to 3 times more than research and development, and the taxpayer cost is much higher. Industry figures here, this is the same study, show the public pays companies about 6 times the R&D costs through high prices on the drugs.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, we pay through our insurance rates, we pay through our taxes for the federal programs that cover drugs.
Yeah, and I, to be honest, though, in defense of advertisements, I never knew I had to be worried about women not liking me because I have yellow toenails. I mean, that's important, man. Come on. But yeah, that's something else, too, the power of suggestion. They tell people, look, you can be cured of this. And I never understood restless leg syndrome, but that's an acknowledged thing now, and they have drugs for that,
Yeah.
And I don't know.
Yeah, that's another approach, is to turn every aberration into a disease and then create a drug for it.
Create a demand for it, yes. Or
Right.
who was it that said it? I can't think of his name now, some smart guy. Manufacturing consent.
Noam Chomsky.
Yes, thank you. I mean, that's basically what they do with the advertising industry. It's animal training, really, and we're all animals. We're all animals, so they get there. And I've been scared by stuff, too, in the past when I was younger. Now I care less. But, it is effective propaganda, which is what these things are. But I guess for the show here, I wanted to highlight just these types of things going on. Oh, and speaking of these things going on, there's also the issue of institutional corruption. A leading health physicist or economist found that 80% of all new expenditures for drugs was spent on the minor variations, not the major advances. And he points out here that institutional corruption is somewhat involved in this. He defines it as systemic legal ways that social institutions such as medical science, the medical profession, and the FDA become compromised by corporate and special interest funding and influence. And I think it was somewhere in this study where I read that the FDA panel that was evaluating a particular drug was discovered to have a corporate representative on the panel as a person with the FDA evaluating it. And that recalls the Interstate Commerce Commission, as I understand it, when it was first created to break up monopolies. They put all railroad company executives on it because, well, they know all about railroads, so they'll be the best at breaking up monopolies, right? Yeah.
Well, Wall Street should decide what Wall Street rules should be, make their own rules.
Yes, well.
They know best how it works, right?
Yeah.
Thanks.
You've been listening to A Pause for Thought with Wayne Parker here on Baton Rouge Community Radio. We got to go. You guys have a good night.